I guess it could be the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I do the best I can. I am going to talk about clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. Normally I would pass around a sign-up sheet for the newsletter of the Ruth Institute, but we have a wonderful table out here with some person staffing that, and they have those lists. So if you want to receive the Ruth Institute's newsletter, you can just go out there and sign up, or you can do what I'm about to suggest that you do. If you look at the intro slide in front of you, after the Ruth Institute, there is an email address. And if you will send an email to that address, Rebecca Turner, who's right out there, will send back to you immediately a link to a Google Drive folder that you can open, and it has a copy of the slides that I'm going to be presenting and most of the resources that I'm going to be referring to. So if you're up with it, and you have your phone, you can send it to her right now, and in about 3 or 4 minutes, you'll have that material. Some of you in the back are going to have trouble seeing some of the slides and some of the statistics that I'm presenting, so you can either move up, or you can send an email and look at it on your phone, or you can complain later, I couldn't see a thing. It's up to you. Well, I'm very pleased and honored to be here today. I have been at a number of the presentations here. When I made time in my schedule, I decided I'd come and I'd stay for the whole experience, both days. And I'm so glad that I did, because I'm looking forward to many of the great presenters that are yet to come. Well, in the Catholic Church, we discovered last summer that we have a problem. And the problem is been already alluded to. It presented to us in the report from a statewide grand jury in Pennsylvania. In August, they reported details of horrific child sex abuse by Catholic priests. Not only that, but that bishops had engaged in what they alleged to be a cover-up. Now, I think that's an exaggeration. It's not fair what they wrote in that report in many ways. If you read the entire report, you find that they have kind of unfairly characterized a lot of the bishops' activities. But nonetheless, there's evidence of bishops not being as effective or as attentive as they should be. And we're going to see more evidence of that even to this very day before this presentation's over. The grand jury reported over 1,000 incidents of abuse by 271 priests from 1934 to 2016. The number of victims ranged from 1 to 37 by single priests. And so a small proportion of the offenders accounted for an outsized number of the victims. Now, this is the most important point on this slide. Under 5% of the abuse that was reported was what would be classed as pedophilia. That would be victims that are under 8 years of age. That is true, inarguable pedophilia. Pedophilia is for a child that has not yet begun puberty. Puberty begins between 11 and 13 years of age, but before that is a stage called prepubescence, when you have the beginning of secondary sex characteristics that appear. So scholars argue about whether that's pedophilia or that's an attraction to older children, which have complicated Latin names. But no one disagrees that if it's children under the age of 8, that's pure pedophilia. Now, what was interesting about this report is that it was really nothing new. We had the same information put out earlier, collected by the John Jay Institute of Criminal Justice, following the last spate of sex abuse in the Catholic Church in 2002. Very similar distribution, although greater numbers, because their collection was nationwide. And in this body, you had over 10,000 victims, 43, almost 4,400 priests, a total of 140 priests, that's 3%, of all of those offenders had multiple victims. In this body of data, under 6% was true pedophilia. The question that comes up in this body of data that's unusual about the abuse in the Catholic Church are the number of male victims. 81% of the victims, the John Jay reports told us, were male. That's very unusual. In sex abuse nationwide, most of the perpetrators are male. About 9 out of 10 sex abusers of children are men. And consequently, most of the victims are girls. Girls are 4 times more likely to be abused in all settings in the United States than boys are. But in the Catholic Church, it's just the opposite. This raises the question, it seems an obvious question, whether these Catholic priest offenders have been men who preferred male victims. We tend to call such persons homosexual, or to have attraction to persons of the same sex. Now, I'm going to use the word homosexual, by the way, in this presentation, instead of maybe the more precise term same-sex attracted, just because that's the term that's used in all of the research that I'm talking about and reviewing, so I don't want to get caught up in all these terminological differences. Now, of the 80% of the abuse was of men overall. If you exclude those under 8 children who were the victims of pedophiles, it was even more. 82% were male. And of the multiple offenders, 91% of those victims were male. So we have men who have been abusing who prefer male victims, it seems. However, the John Jay report, commissioned by the U.S. bishops, concluded that homosexual men in the priesthood had nothing to do with the spate of sexual abuse. They gave 2 reasons. The first reason is that when homosexual men were entering the seminaries in the 1980s, the trend or the spate of sexual abuse was starting to decline. And so they reasoned that since the number of male victims, or the proportion of male victims, was going down during the time when the homosexual men were most frequent in the seminaries, the 2 could not be related. The second reason they gave had to do with terminology. They point out that not everyone who commits a same-sex act calls themselves homosexual. And so they say, quote, "It's possible that, although the victims of the priests were most often male, thus defining the acts as homosexual, the priest did not at any time recognize his identity as homosexual." Now, both of these arguments are a little bit sketchy on themselves. It's true that not everybody who commits a same-sex act calls himself homosexual. Only about 90% of people do. So they're kind of stretching that argument a bit. But they're making empirical claims. And so what I want you to do is to kind of put on your thinking hat, your social science hat. Sometimes in class I would call this the basic sociology hat, but the initials of that are probably not too helpful. And think about these matters of fact, because that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And as a matter of simple empirical fact, both of these claims are emphatically false. Let's take a look at them. The first one, the first argument, they said, if sexual identity and the abuse of a minor were linked by gender, then an increase in the homosexual men in the priesthood would have led to an increase in the abuse of male victims compared to female victims. Well, that's a sensible statement. Yes, it would have. But they argue that the peak of the abuse of boys occurred in the 1970s, while homosexual men were not reported in seminaries in large numbers until the 1980s. Therefore, they claim the increase in, quote, homosexual men in the seminaries in the 1980s does not correspond to an increase in the number of boys who were abused. Well, there are a number of problems with that argument. First problem is, as they openly concede, they said, we don't know whether the expression of homosexual identity in the seminaries in the 1980s was because there were more homosexual men entering the seminary in the 1980s, or there were more men who were willing to reveal themselves as homosexual at that time. If you remember back to the 1980s, which I know many of you probably don't, but if you're old enough to remember, that was a time when the stigma of being homosexual was dropping rapidly. And there was widespread growth in acceptance of a homosexual identity. And a lot of folk during that time were coming out. They were revealing themselves to be homosexual. Didn't mean they became homosexual at that moment. I mean, they had been so for quite some time, but they were more open to revealing that. And so that very well may have happened among the Catholic priests and in the Catholic seminaries, so that the entry of homosexuals into those institutions happened before that. The second problem is that their own data show that the percent of male victims peaked not in the 1970s, but in the 1980s. And you see here on the side of this, and I'm going to come out here now, you see these two bars right here. This is the 1970s, and this is the 1980s. And you see the 1980s is a little higher than it is in the 1970s. They never address why this is in their report. They built this whole argument about the fact that it was starting to go down in the 1980s. It was highest in the 1970s. If you actually look at the data they present, it was just as high in the 1980s as it was in the 1970s. But that's not even the biggest problem with their study. The problem is that they are looking at all of the allegations of abuse that were presented to them. And most of the allegations of the abuse are retrospective. There are persons who are waking up and remembering that they were abused as a child long before. The average look-back time is 28 and a half years. Half of the reports are persons remembering more than 30 years, some of them 50 or 60 years after they've been abused. So if you're looking at a trend over time and most of the reports are retrospective, what can you say about abuse as it gets closer and closer to the present time? And what happens is you begin to understate current abuse and overstate past abuse, and you move the center of the distribution to the past. Now, I'm demonstrating this for you in these two slides, in this slide here today. You have two sets of bars, one red and one blue, and the peak of the red bars are the retrospective reports. In the blue bars, I only look at reports of abuse that occurred at the current time, in the current year. 1/5 of the reports were reports of people who said, my child is being abused right now, or the child who says, you know, the father so-and-so is doing things to me now, or did things to me within the past few months, and that report gets reported and recorded. And so if you look at the reports of current abuse, you see that the peak shows up later in the blue bars. The peak of the blue bars is here in the 1980s. The peak of the red bars is back further. So if you correct for what we would call a right truncating skew in the data, you find that the peak of the abuse was just when they have the reported homosexual men in the seminary. But there's even a bigger problem, and that is that the John Jay report never actually looked at the data that exists on the number of homosexual men in the seminary. In fact, we do have good random sample data on these things. And if you look at that random sample data, you find, I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, this trend. And this looks at the percentage of priests in these periods who reported that they were homosexual. The Los Angeles Times did a survey randomly sampling all Catholic priests in the country, and they asked them about their sexual orientation. And so these priests reported their sexual orientation. They also reported when they were ordained and other factors. And so I was able to take and group them by the times in which they were ordained and the percentage of priests reporting a homosexual attraction during those times. And you see that oh, sorry. How do I go back? Okay. Sorry, I was one slide off. You see here that the percentage of homosexual men was very low during the 1950s and started to climb. And during the 1980s, it shot up. 1/3 of all Catholic priests that were ordained between 1980 and 1984 report to us that they were homosexual in orientation. Actually, in one year, the year 1983, half of all Catholic priests who were ordained in that year were homosexual. And so you had this huge spike of homosexual men. But you know what? You had over 1 in 5 Catholic priests ordained during the 1970s also who were homosexual. So you have plenty of homosexual men coming into the Catholic priesthood during this era. So we have two trends. We have a trend of sex abuse that rose and peaked in about the 1980s, and we have a trend of homosexual men entering seminaries that also rose and peaked in the 1980s. And if you overlay those two trends, as this next slide does, you see that they're very similar trends. If you do a correlation between these two trends, it's a 0.90 correlation. Now, positive correlations go from 0 to 1. So 1.0 would be a perfect correlation. 0.90 is a very, very strong correlation. So if someone says, Catholic clergy sex abuse is not at all related to homosexual men in the priesthood, you can say, well, you know what? It is. I've seen the evidence. And it's not only related, it's very strongly related. In fact, we also have another factor. And that is that a number of persons who were involved in seminaries report that in the 1980s, a lot of Catholic seminaries became kind of a haven or a party place for homosexual men, homosexual subcultures. Now, if you have gotten to the resource site and downloaded the paper under this, I give you the sites and the resources, the quotations from those who have written about this. But they report that there were subcultures of homosexual seminarians and seminary faculty. They were not sexually abstinent. They were sexually active with one another. And they encouraged a lot of homosexual expression in Catholic seminaries. It's not edifying to read or to think about, but that's what was going on in a number of Catholic seminaries in the 1980s. In fact, in the survey data, which I'm showing you here, they asked these priests, this was in 2002, when you were ordained, was there a homosexual subculture in your seminary? And as you can see, over half of the men that were ordained from 1980 through the early 1990s responded, yes, there was. And so we have these institutions that are supposed to form men to holiness of life and faithfulness of service, and it's actually forming them into homosexual expression. The same ones who report to us that we had these homosexual subcultures going on report that heterosexual men felt disoriented in these environments and would leave the seminaries. So we had this perverse negative effect of what is supposed to be a very positive formation going on during this time. Did these things contribute to the spate or the spike of sex abuse? Well, here's the correlation between homosexual subcultures and sex abuse. And that's even stronger. It's 0.96. It's hard to get much closer to 1.0 and be in the real world because there's uncertainty in the data. In fact, the level of uncertainty of the data goes well above 1.0 on these measures. So this is a perfect correlation between homosexual subcultures and clergy sex abuse. Okay, so this gets into really nerdy stuff. These are regression coefficients, standardized regression coefficients. You interpret them like correlations. And I'm just showing you this slide to make a couple of points. First, what I showed you before is a little incomplete in terms of an argument because it was correlating by 5-year periods. This correlates by single-year period, the most precise we can get. All of the correlations are stronger if you do it by single year. Usually correlations get weaker if you do that, but these get even stronger. The correlation between the percent of victims who were male and the percent of priests who were homosexual in any given year is this one right here. You can see that's about as close to 1 as you can possibly get. It is a perfect correlation between the number or percent of homosexual priests and the percent of male victims. This one over here puts into that model also the, well, this is the incidence, the number of victims in any given year. And here you see that that's also a product of homosexual, of the seminary subcultures. And so both of those go together to increase the number of victims. The percentage of homosexual men, it tells us what the sex of those victims is going to be. I put this one in here. This is a lower correlation. This is just those children that are under age 7, the pedophiles. These people will tell you, well, these are pedophiles. They're not attracted to one sex or the other. They abuse boys and girls equally. Well, usually they do, but in the Catholic Church, they didn't. There's still a 0.77 correlation. That's a strong correlation. If they abused equally boys and girls, it would be a 0 correlation. So there was still a preference for boys, even among those that we would call pedophiles in the Catholic faith. So unlike sex abuse in any other setting, almost in American society, we had a concentrated homosexual predation of boys in the Catholic Church. I call that the bad news for us. Now, I want to mention the other argument that John Jay College made, which is that the men may have been abusing boys, but they didn't think of themselves as homosexual. They didn't call themselves homosexual. And therefore, they say it has nothing to do with homosexual men. Now, you might say, well, you know, they could call themselves anything they want. If they're abusing boys, I would call them homosexual. And a lot of folks who study this just categorize them by the sex of their victims. So, but in order to speak to that argument, what I did was to go and actually look at research. We have studies of priest offenders that are in treatment settings, and it tells us how they identify themselves. And here I present to you from 3 of those studies the fact that they actually did identify themselves as homosexual. In one study, 57% of those who abused older victims, when asked their sexual orientation, reported themselves to be homosexual. Now, somewhere under 2% of men in American society overall would identify as homosexual, even today. And so you have 2% compared to 57%. I'd say that's a high preponderance of men identifying as homosexuals in that group. And likewise in these other groups. You have another one 46%, or another one 67% of men who are report themselves to be homosexual. So when someone says, or the John Jay report says, well, maybe the offenders didn't think of themselves as homosexual, you say, well, if you look at how they thought of themselves, they tell us, yes, we do think of ourselves as homosexual. None of this research was looked at or is reported in the John Jay study. So this is the bad news, that the Catholic Church ordained large numbers of homosexual men in these sexually active subcultures and seminaries. And while the bishops looked the other way or weren't paying attention, and in some cases even enabled the activity, they were able to harm thousands of boys due to sexual predation. Doing all that great, terrible harm to the relationship with God and with others for those men. Billions in settlement payouts. We're up to almost $4 billion the church has paid out. And all of us losing confidence in our bishops. That's the bad news. But people will say, well, that happened all long ago, right? One of the bishops responding to the Pennsylvania grand jury report said this: that's the church of the past. Now we've become the safest place for children. Because in 2002, we instituted the Charter for the Protection of Children. And that's been very successful and very effective, they will tell you. And so today, we don't have much sex abuse at all. And that was reported also in the John Jay reports. That's because, well, I just want to say, if that's not true, if we still have sex abuse going on today to a measurable, substantive extent, it hasn't evaporated, then I would say that would be worse news. That's a present problem that we have. So let's look at this. The John Jay report told us that the sex abuse in the current time was insignificant, very little of it. Here is the distribution. This slide here, this chart here is taken from the John Jay report itself, and you can see the huge spike and then the decline. Look, in the present day, it's almost nothing. Here's from the Pennsylvania grand jury report. You have the same distribution, different number of cases. You have almost nothing down here. So they would say, well, gee, Father Paul, you're talking about a problem that's long past. We don't have to worry about it today. But the problem is, this is just making the same point. You can see in the modern time, where that arrow is pointing, it looks like we have almost no abuse. The problem is, it's really misleading because you're looking at only those retrospective reports. And if you're looking at retrospective reports about abuse that's happening today, right now, most of the reports look back 30 years. What's it going to look like today? It's going to look like you have almost no abuse. Unless you have some way to time travel 30 years into the future and get all the reports that people are going to be making at that time about the abuse that's happening today, you're always going to understate current abuse. And so you can only tell how much current abuse there is if you correct for those understatements. Here are those two charts. I think I already showed you this to make the point that the height was more advanced here for the blue bars, right? Now I want to make another point from the same distribution. Here you can see, if you're looking at just the retrospective reports, it looks like we have almost no abuse in the current time. But look what happens if you're looking at the reports of current abuse. It goes down, but not nearly as much. In fact, you have about as much going on here, if you follow it across, as was going on in the late 60s, early 1970s. That's the level of abuse that we have today. But even that understates, to some extent, the level of abuse. This is just looking at those current reports, again, to give you a more clear picture. If you look at the 2010 to 14, you have 50 incidents of abuse. If you look at 1960 to 64, you have 49 incidents of abuse. They're pretty similar. But even that understates it a bit. What I did was to look at all of the reports of abuse that have been reported since 2010 of abuse that occurred since 1990. This gets rid of most of the look back and gives us a much clearer trend of current abuse. And what you can see is that abuse went down. Now here was the implementation of the charter. Abuse went down during this period, started to rise a little bit, and look, it's kind of shot up in the current decade, right? When people scratch their heads and say, oh, I don't want to believe that. Don't tell me we got abuse coming back, but we do. Here, in case that's not convincing you enough, here's the retrospective reports. These are 15-year encapsulations because I'm using the grand jury report, fewer cases. So to get a trend, from 2003 to 2016, 3.1% of all abuse that was ever reported was reported during that time. If you're only looking at retrospective reports, if you look at the current reports, it triples. We have 9% of all abuse. But you know what? There's another factor, and that is that we have way fewer priests today than we had back in the 1980s and in the 1970s. Did you know that we have a decline of priests? People talk about it as a priest shortage. I don't think that's the correct term to use, but we have far fewer. We have only about half as many priests today as we had in the early 1970s. So you have to correct for that, right? You have fewer priests doing abuse. It wouldn't be fair to say, well, we have half as many priests, and so if we only had half as many incidents, you really got to compare apples with that. Otherwise, we could get rid of all abuse by just getting rid of all priests, right? That would solve no more clergy sex abuse, no more clergy, right? That's kind of the perverted logic of abortion, really. We're going to cure this kid by killing it. So we have to adjust for that. So if you adjust for the decline in the number of priests, you find that we have even more abuse that's going on, adjusted for clergy. And here's the whole trend. No, there's not. Sorry. Here's the whole trend. Adjusted for clergy, the number of clergy through the present time. And you can see that since the early 2000s, the abuse has risen pretty steadily, pretty generally. It's coming back. And it's coming back. I discovered, after I did all this, I said, is this really the case? It looks like from this chart that we're getting complacent. We got real serious in the early 2000s, and abuse just about completely disappeared, and now it's creeping up again. Is there any evidence for that? Well, yeah, I found some very explicit evidence for that. Every year, the USCCB authorizes the Stonebridge auditing firm to visit Catholic dioceses and do an audit of their level of compliance with the charter requirements and to see what the level of sex abuse is in their dioceses. And they report these figures every year. And in the latest report, which was put out in 2017, there's a section called The Tone at the Top. Where am I? There. Tone at the Top, general complacency. And they list the diocese, they don't list the names of the dioceses, but the number of dioceses that are failing to comply with the requirements of the charter and sensible things that may not be formal requirements of the charter, but should be done. Background checks not being completed. Instance where some clergy, employees and volunteers, had not been screened and yet still had contact with children, people slipping through. 25% of the dioceses have not required any refresher safe environment training since it was first implemented in 2002. After 16 years, they have lots of new employees. They have almost a complete turnover in many instances. Those new employees have not been required to take this training. And they also say, we've made these suggestions for years. We pointed this out. People are not paying attention. In the cover letter to this report, the chair of the National Review Board says this: the apparent complacency that is emerging seems to suggest that some, and they're talking about some bishops, believe that the sexual abuse of minors by the clergy is now an historic event of the past. Well, I can tell you, every bishop I've talked to, and most Catholic pundits I've talked to, emphatically say, well, it's a thing of the past. Here, our own audit review board is telling us this. This would be an unfortunate conclusion, as this year's audit report makes evident. And it goes on to tell about the discovery of 24 new allegations of abuse, of current abuse, going on in the year 2017. And he goes on to say, now he's saying this in very polite language to the bishops, but he's saying that the report highlights recommendations and best practices from the auditors. He says, these recommendations are not requirements of the charter. I don't know why they're not requirements of the charter, but the bishops didn't require all of these things, nor are they related to compliance, but they may prove helpful in their ongoing implementation of the charter, particularly in stemming the wave of complacency, which is coterminous with the, once again, rise of sex abuse. So some of you were talking to me earlier saying, well, I'm going to be meeting with my bishop, or we're going to be doing things in our diocese. What I suggest to you is you get this report and you look at those items that aren't being done in many dioceses. Ask your bishop, do you require refresher safe environment training since it was first implemented? And when was it done? And some of the other things that have contributed to the rise of sex abuse. Well, that's worse news. The very big problem of sex abuse may be rising again. The bishops are going into repeated neglect. Some bishops have not even learned the lessons of 2002 and now the lessons of 2018. But all that happened long ago, right? What possible good news could there be? I promise you bad news, then worse news, and good news. I do have good news for you. Since I published this first study, by the way, my first study that I've been presenting you so far was based on the same data that the John Jay College used. They were kind enough to share their data with me, and I re-examined that. Since I put it out, I've received another body of data that follows up to the present time. And I'm able to merge that with the grand jury data. The wonderful gift of the Pennsylvania grand jury is that we have reports of incidents of sex abuse up to the current time. They don't just stop at 2002. And if we look at those current reports, what we find is that the percent of victims that are male have dropped dramatically since 2000. Up to the current time, male victimization is rapidly on the decline. Now, this is, I'm sharing with you a preview of a study that hasn't yet been released. It's not entirely finished. We're going to be releasing it next month. And so you guys are hearing it here first. Male victimization has declined. Abuse is rising, but it's not abuse of boys so much. It's more abuse of girls. Some people say, well, that's kind of a relief in kind of this strange kind of way. And I guess it is. I mean, if you think about what's natural and unnatural, but it's not a relief in that we have now girls that are being subject to unacceptable levels of victimization. Very few of the new abuse that's occurring is the product of newly ordained priests. Here I took the percent of the victimization that was being done by men who were newly ordained. And newly ordained I defined as ordained in the last 10 years, right? And so you see that abuse through 1980, in the 60s and 70s, half of it was by men who had just been ordained. In the 1980s, a quarter of it by men who had just been ordained. But in the present century, since 2000, we don't have any of the currently reported abuse that has been performed by men who have been recently ordained. Now, I think of that as good news. It means that we have this wave of abusive priests that is kind of working their way through the clergy, the presbyterate. And the priests that are being newly ordained that are coming up are not of that character. They're not engaging in this situation. In fact, if you look at the percent of priests currently being ordained who are homosexual, it is the same as if none were being ordained. Now, I don't think it's exactly none, but it's very close to none. We have very few new homosexual priests that are being ordained. I've talked to some of these seminary directors, the diocesan vocation directors. We have this new generation of young, very faithful priests. We call them the John Paul II priests, and many of them are in decision-making positions with regard to ordination and vocations, and they're not ordaining any same-sex attracted or homosexual man. They have reasserted the constant teaching of the church, which is that a man who is homosexual should not be ordained. That has been taught since the early 1970s. It was reaffirmed in 2005. Pope Francis himself recently reaffirmed that idea. Homosexuality is incompatible with priestly service. And so they're following that, They're putting that into place, and we're finding that we are, I think, being purified and being relieved of the presence of these homosexual men. It hasn't completely taken place yet, but I think it's around the corner. It's our future. So that's the good news, and I want to leave you with that good news. Again, if you want any of the materials that I presented to you so far in this presentation, you can get it by emailing me. If you didn't already, email Rebecca, and you're welcome to do that. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. Yeah, I think so.
I'm going to ask the questions. And
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
I'll go here.
All right.
And you go over there. All right. We've got a couple of questions here for Father Sullins, and I'd like him to see if he can. What I do is try, as I explained before, I try to put them into categories, and we end up by having a couple of questions following a certain pattern. So you're all hopefully going to get covered in your questions. Who sponsored and paid for the John Jay report?
The U.S. Catholic bishops, with support from about a dozen other Catholic-related organizations.
Do you think that made a difference into why they were? Did that skew it a little bit to make them get it so wrong?
I don't know. It might have. People, always look at who funded studies to figure out bias in that. If you take a copy of the John Jay report, either 2004 or 2011, on the resource drive, if you've downloaded it, both reports are right there, and they report their funding sources at the beginning of both reports, and you can make up your own mind about that.
Couldn't you argue that people report earlier than they did in the past, and there is more awareness, and parents are more on guard for these situations of abuse, and that's why it's going down?
Well, that would be an argument for it going up, right? So if we see a decline, and in the current era, people are more likely to report abuse, we would have to say children are more likely to report abuse and more likely to be believed when they report abuse, then it would enforce even more strongly the fact that abuse is going down. And it has gone down. If you look at only current reports, abuse today is only about 1/4 as high as it was at its peak. So I wouldn't want to suggest that we have a peak or a large spike of abuse today. We have recurring abuse. Now, in the new report that's coming forth, I separate out the abuse of girls over time from the abuse of boys over time. And what we have today is a peak time of the abuse of girls. We have more abuse of girls than we have had heretofore in the Catholic Church. So what has disappeared is the victimization of boys. We have the disappearing of the homosexual predator priest. And in its place, we would call them the heterosexual predator priest. It's not as high. It's not it's not as common or as high, but it's higher than it has been in the past.
Is the homosexual correlation possibly due to access? More likely to, and I can't read that word. More likely to be in line with the present than was having girls around.
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah. I spent about 10 pages in the study addressing just this question. There's a section called, is it orientation or opportunity? And what I conclude is that it's both. Both factors really figure in. It's not an either or question, right? It could be both. Men who prefer male victims, and then when they have access to more male victims, then that just fits right in with what they're looking for, and so they both go. If you compare that correlation that I showed you of victims under age 8, that was a lower correlation, 0.77. For all boys, it was 0.98. Now, what's important about that is that if you think about victims under age 8, you're not going to have any altar servers in that group. There's not going to be any differential access to boys for victims that young, generally speaking. And so the difference between those two might have to do with, decreased opportunity among those younger children. So yeah, opportunity is a factor in all crime, and certainly it would be a factor in this kind of abuse. But it doesn't. It's not. It's such an overwhelming factor that it makes unimportant the much stronger effect of homosexuality in the seminary subcultures.
And I think this is going to have to be the final one. Is your data only from the US, or have you studied data from Europe, Latin America, and insights on that if you have?
These data are only from the US. The John Jay data are only from the US. We do have some data that have come out. There was a sex abuse report in Germany, and we're in the process of trying to get those data, and we have some other reports from around the world that we may be looking at in the future. What I can tell you from our initial looks at that is that the connection with homosexuality is very, very similar. In the German report that came out in September, although they deny that in the introduction and the way they present the report, if you look at the data in that report, over 90% of the victims that are described in that report are boys. And so you have the same kind of dynamics that are going on.
Thank you very much, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.